Welcome to Section 8 of the webinar training for Electronic Security Networking Technician, or ESNT. This 9-session workshop, along with the hands-on networking lab and a written certification test, will lead to the ETA's ESNT certification. My name is Ray Coulomb, and I'll be your instructor for the following 60 minutes or so to go through the topic of network security. There are really three main goals when it comes to network security. Think of the acronym CIA. C for confidentiality, I for integrity, and A for availability. Confidentiality means that only authorized users can access the data, can see the data. Quite often that data is important, sensitive, confidential to a company or government, and you just don't want anybody else to see it. You want to keep it confidential. Integrity means that the data doesn't change in the process of being transmitted, received, or processed. You only want authorized users to be able to alter that data in whatever fashion. Availability means that the data is there when you need it, and that the resources, the network, and all that implies, the transmission, is available for its intended use. You don't want it to go down for whatever reason, be it act of God, act of terror, unintentional. That access needs to be continuous and uninterrupted. So part of network security is making sure that the resources are there when you need them. Security threats are many. The adversaries can be nations, they can be individuals, they can be joyriders, fun seekers, competitors, employees. It spans the gamut. The most worrisome adversaries are, in my opinion, the nation states, those who are conducting espionage, stealing state secrets, shortcutting the path to R&D, that there is a national strategic interest in play, and this happens with nations across the globe. Also worrisome are the adversaries who are trying to get into the network data because it's profitable to do so. Online crime is a multi-hundreds of billions or more business that's attracted a lot of unsavory people, and they're getting smarter and better at doing what they do. Motivations can be, as I said, intelligence or theft of important information. It can be for the joy of denying service. It can be a protest. It can be for adverse profit motives, any number of things. And classes of attacks can be passive or active. They can be inside, outside. They can be distributed from without. And the attack vectors are many and varied. Threats have changed over time. Way back when, in the early days, when hacking wasn't even called hacking, people would try to guess passwords, crack passwords. The tools and techniques were very crude, as were the countermeasures to deal with those. But as time has gone on, as you can see from this graph, hackers have gotten better, more sophisticated, better armed. Hacking information is easily obtained worldwide, and the technical knowledge to implement that has gone down. So there are even a 12 or 13-year-old kid with the right set of tools and some basic knowledge can do some damage. And that is a worrisome trend. So let's look at attacks on confidentiality. Again, this is keeping the data confined to only those who are supposed to see it. And as you would expect, there are a number of ways in which these attacks can be implemented. and data received by those who aren't supposed to receive it. Here are some: packet capture, ping suites, wiretapping, social engineering, dumpster diving, and we're going to look at these in a bit more detail here in the following slides. It all starts with scanning a network, and once again, as you'll see, network scanners and scanning tools are commonly available, and the intent is to look at what devices are on the network and what their addresses and characteristics are. What operating system are they using? What facilities and services are they using? Is there something that they're using that may be subject to an attack? Maybe it's something for which there's a well-known vulnerability, or for which whoever generated the application in the first place hasn't come out with a patch. So, as I said, there are a variety of tools that hackers can scan networks with. Nmap, you'll see a sample of that here in just a second, is available basically for free by download. And there are other programs, whether they be free or for pay, that one can use to scan networks. So here's an example of an Nmap scan. And as we look at the scan here, you see that here the scan starts. It's going through. It's looking at the ports at a particular device, the protocol that's running on the port, the state of the port, the service that's running on that port. So to take one that's pretty simple, here's port 80, which is TCP, running the HTTP, common port used by a web server. Device type is general purpose. Here you see it's running the Linux operating system and the specific OS, uptime, and then interesting ports. And so we'll go on down here, and here you see another device that's running these ports. Some are well-known ports, others are further up the port number and chain. Here's the MAC address of that device. Here's its operating system and details, and you can pretty well see what's going on with that machine in terms of the services it's running and the ports. So if a particular service had a known vulnerability, that could be the basis for an attack vector on that particular machine, whose MAC address we actually know right now. Notice also that because we know the MAC address, we automatically know the manufacturer, or we can find that out very, very quickly. So hackers will scan for that port status, and what does some of the nomenclature mean? Well, closed means that it responds to the scan. In other words, you're able to see it, but it's really not available for any kind of a communication. Open is the opposite. Stealth port may be being used, but it doesn't respond to the scan. It doesn't show up on the scanner, so we don't know what's going on there. We don't know its status. And if it's a filtered port, then once again, we may not be able to get to it if it's behind a firewall who is restricting access to who gets to go to that particular device or port. Why different port scans? Well, in order to communicate from one host device on a network to another on the same or a different network, the communication at the TCP level occurs from a port on one machine to a port on another machine. Those ports must be open and available to communicate with each other. So if I was addressing a web server, I would be communicating with port 80 on the remote server. The port on my own machine could be arbitrarily assigned. It could be 5,272 or some other number. And that 5272 on my machine would have to be open, as would port 80 on the corresponding machine. There are over 65,000 available ports, and the lower numbers in this numerical range are well-known ports. That is, a specific port is known to correspond to a specific service, like domain naming, file transfer, web browsing, HTTP, all of which use specific port numbers. A scanner could use different techniques, or you might use a different scanner for different operating systems. It's basically the engineering, the scanner, and the software makes it perhaps more suitable for one than the other. And also the security settings on the network and the firewall might make one scanner work better than another. So there's variability in scanners, scanning techniques, and what is scanned. But the basic point is there is software that's out there that with a scan can give someone a pretty good idea of what's sitting there on the network, what's open, what's closed. Continuing on with confidentiality, one of the greatest sources of concern in a network is on the wireless portion of the network because it's out there. It's in open air. Rather than having wires perhaps encased within a building, locked down, Wi-Fi is out there for the getting. And if you can grab those packets out of thin air and make something of them, then you've got, again, the potential basis for some type of an attack on the network. At the very least, seeing what's flowing through the air and looking at the data. An attack on confidentiality is just that, seeing data that you're not supposed to see. So here are a number of the types of attacks that we will go through here. War drivers, hackers, rogue access points, employees, privacy vulnerabilities, talk about technique for actually scanning on the Wi-Fi network, and evil twin. So war driver sounds like a military video game or something, but it really, in this context, pertains to a would-be hacker who takes a scanning equipment. The equipment is capable of scanning the airwaves and grabbing whatever is out there. And quite often this is done by driving around and simply seeing what's out there. And you would still be amazed at the kinds of networks, the number of networks that are available and locked down or not locked down, but many of which are still visible and therefore potentially addressable. We mentioned Net Stumbler, which is one of the Wi-Fi scanning techniques, and here's a type of output that one might plan to see. So we're going along here, and the first thing that we'll point out are the SSIDs, or the system identifier, and so that would pertain to a particular wireless network broadcasting out, and one would ask to join that particular SSID called airwave. And sitting there on that network, you've got a number of MAC devices, MAC addresses. Here you see them communicating on different channels, the name that might be attached to that, the manufacturer of that device, and there may be some other parameters as well. For example, here you see signal to noise ratio type information. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, roughly 7, 8 different networks that are vulnerable. Here we see that some of them are running a WEP privacy protocol. Here we see some signal strength, and really gives you a pretty good idea of what's happening out there on the airwaves, and a first clue as to which devices or which networks might be vulnerable. We mentioned WEP. WEP is Wired Equivalent Privacy, and this is one of the first protocols used in Wi-Fi to provide some level of privacy. It goes back quite a ways, and when this was first implemented, In the early days, encryption wasn't particularly strong, but it looked like it was strong enough. The fact that you're simply encrypting your data appeared to be good enough. The encryption used what's called pre-shared static keys. So that means that that you would actually put a key into the remote device that was trying to communicate with the network, and in fact that's still done now, except the keys are longer and more complex. But as time went on, that encryption became less and less suitable, and even in 2005, the FBI demonstrated that key cracking could occur in a very short period of time using publicly available tools. And so after some major snafus in the marketplace, such as one with TJ Maxx, where a lot of credit card data was stolen through the compromising of an IP network, a wireless IP network, the payment card industry, otherwise known as PCI, actually prohibited the use of any kind of credit card processing using this WEP encryption protocol. So it goes back a ways to 1997. In fact, it is an IEEE standard. But over the years that followed, there were a succession of other Wi-Fi privacy standards that came about, each one being stronger than the next. And so now WPA2 is generally recognized as the strongest encryption to employ for common usage in wireless routers. So if you have your own wireless router and you look at it, you'll see in all probability that you have the choice between WEP, WPA, WPA2, and unless there's some overwhelming reason not to use it, I would certainly recommend the use of WPA2. Okay, another wireless type of an attack is called a rogue or evil twin AP, and this is really a result of being able to understand what the characteristics of the real AP or access point are. MAC addresses can be reprogrammed, SSIDs are programmed, and so it's possible to make an access point look like another access point with the same characteristics. And if you can spoof it, you can gain potential access to confidential information or non-confidential information like passwords, usernames, and so forth. Now, a non-electronic technique of doing that same thing is called social engineering. And that's really getting inside the facility through social means, bypassing the receptionist, masquerading as a utility worker, even tailgating an employee by saying that you've lost your employee pass or you left it in your desk or whatever. Once you gain access to that building and you can gain physical access to the network, perhaps installing a wireless router, another rogue access point, these are all techniques of tapping into that data stream and seeing data that you're not supposed to see. Here's another scheme called phishing, and phishing is we've probably all been subject to it. Quite often it happens through email, where we get an email that looks like it's legit. The email and the characteristics, the graphics, and everything about it appears to be for real, but it's not. There's some obvious tip-off to that. This is a subpoena, apparently from a U.S. District Court, but then you see the email address subpoena at uscourts.com. And when was the last time you saw a government entity that used the .com instead of a .gov suffix? Another way to do it is typically these things will want you to click on a link to get more information. If you simply hover over the link, wherever that hyperlink happens to be, you'll see the actual web address or destination site pop up at the bottom of your screen, and with that you can kind of compare that versus what the email purports to be. One practice I like to use is when I suspect something like this, and I've seen them from DHL, not really from DHL, but to look like it came from DHL freight, from various banks and so forth, credit card agencies, is to copy that email and whatever information you can get about that, and to forward that to the fraud department of the entity that is spoofing and let them investigate it. Chances are it's going to correlate with other attacks that they've seen and allow them to chase down whoever's behind it. Well, this is kind of a funny one, but it happens as well. How often is material thrown in the dumpster without being shredded? Talking about paper, or even machines that are brought to the the local landfill or electronic recycling, be they computers, copy machines, hard drives, whatever. Very, very often there's information resident in these things that shouldn't be. They were not erased or properly handled before they were disposed of. So one must be aware that confidential information can exist in all kinds of forms, electronic, written, hardware, and that any of it is potentially retrievable by somebody on the outside. So the message is you handle that stuff properly. Okay, we've been talking about confidentiality, the ability to see things that shouldn't be seen. Now we ratchet that up a bit and look at something that can really be destructive, and that is an attack on the integrity of the data, actually changing that data stream so it's something else. And this can happen through a number of attack vectors, be they password attacks, trust exploits, hijacking a session, redirecting to another port, or the proverbial botnet. So let's take a look at attacks on integrity. First of all, passwords are a necessary evil. And the larger corporations, banks, many others will have certain password rules. And I guess the first message here is when you're in a password situation, particularly in programming a piece of equipment, do not maintain the default passwords. The default passwords on any piece of equipment, be it Cisco, Access IP cameras, you name it, those default passwords are well known. And they're the first thing that somebody will try once they gain access electronically to that equipment. So you want to change them. This applies to end devices like IP cameras as well as the network devices themselves. On the network devices, all the physical ports and virtual ports need to be protected as well. And it's possible to have security on these guys, sometimes with passwords and other times just via other means. Rule of thumb is that the password should be at least 8 characters and a mix of numbers, symbols, capitals, lowercase, to the extent that's allowed by the system that you're programming. And because passwords can be discovered through regular communication, pattern analysis, and whatnot, you don't even need to steal the password. Sometimes just stealing the code, it's called a hash code, that is created from the password is all that is needed to get the access that's required. IP camera passwords are certainly a part of this. Here you see a screen from an Access camera here on the left, and the process through which you go to setting it up. Access actually has a nice feature of being able to set those passwords securely, and it's a straightforward process to do so, something that is similar to many other pieces of equipment out there. But again, change it from the default to something that is going to work for you. This is sort of an obvious question and answer, but A lot of people didn't get the password memo, it appears. All you really need to do is to go to Google or some search engine, type in hack CCTV cameras, and look at the number of hits that you get. There are YouTube videos explaining how to do it. There are techniques. There are lists of cameras you can access. It is mind-boggling. Now, some camera access is designed to be shared. If you're looking at a resort or a beach or something like that, it may become part of a company's marketing program. In some cases, that is the intent, but there are pan-tilt cameras where the intention was not to share pan-tilt. And so there are different levels of passwords, be it view, control, and so forth, may be implementable on that device. So lock down your devices with good passwords and understand that that it's all fair game once it goes online. Well, you'd think IP packets to be secure, but if somebody can gain access to the data and manipulate the packet, then that compromises the integrity of the packet. In one sense, it can be destructive just because the data is no longer good, it's been compromised. Another way, though, that data, depending on what part of that packet is manipulated, can be diverted to another location. It can actually cause the network to go down depending on how actually that packet is manipulated. So we'll take a closer look at some examples of that. First of all, let's just review the IP header structure so you can see the types of fields that are in there. Again, this is the header structure, so the data would appear after this. But within this header, you see a fragment offset, protocol, source destination addresses, and as well as some options, and time to live. So this is the number of hops that IP packet can go through before it's effectively killed by the network. So one type of attack is the IP spoofing attack. As we learned earlier in the course, there's a three-way handshake in TCP. There's the initial request, which sets a SYN bit. There's a response, which sets the 2 bits SYN and ACK. And then there's a final response from the originator, basically saying, I got it, let's go, let's talk, that sets the ACK bit going back. So if you have an attacker trying to hit that destination, and he hits that ACK bit before the originator does, then that can potentially set up a communication between the attacker and the destination. Not good. Here's a closer look at the TCP header, in which those bits are set. So here's the header right here. Here's the actual data that flows down from layer 5. And here in the middle of the header, you see those 6 control bits. Here's the ACK bit, here's the SYN bit, and here's the reset bit. So the ACK bit being active, that field be set to a 1. SYN bit being active, that field be set to a 1. So by actually creating a data packet from an attacker that had the appropriate bits set, you've got the basis for a compromise there. Application layer attacks really get to the endpoint, the actual user of the application, and there are statistics that say that 70% of network attacks occur not at the edge or in the network, but at the application itself, which is particularly worrisome because of the number of applications that end users happen to run. So, as we saw in Nmap, we can determine through a network scan what the operating system is. Linux and Windows are the most common OSs, and they have vulnerabilities. Windows generally regarded to have more vulnerabilities than Linux. And each OS handles specific packets and its communications differently. And a hacker knows that. So that if there were specific vulnerabilities that he was aware of or learned about of a particular OS, patched to a given level or not patched, then there's knowledge that could be used against the application. So what does that mean? That systems need to be patched frequently. Microsoft typically comes out with a set of patches once a month. There are exploits that occur between the time those patches come out, and quite often the patches are chasing the exploits. However, generally speaking, it's safe practice to install those patches, whether it be on an operating system or another piece of software, as soon as those are available. Many physical devices will use a proprietary operating system or an embedded Linux system, which normally are less vulnerable to attack than the common Windows sorts of operating systems. One type of attack that falls in this category is called the buffer overflow. So what you're trying to do is to create a stack buffer overflow by throwing a bunch of data into it, and then with that overflow, in the chaos, installing something malicious. And so here you see a number of examples of exploits in Unix, in Microsoft SQL, even in a Wii gaming device, by giving a lengthy character name for the horse in the Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. So this caused a stack buffer overflow, and then, as I said, in the chaos, you've got the opportunity for perhaps arbitrary code to be run on that system, thereby compromising it. So this can be implemented by a variety of means: worms, Trojan horses, viruses, infected spam, you name it. So those are some vectors, some types of attacks that can be used to compromise the integrity of a system, i.e. data change. The last one, or last major category, is availability. Attacks that can bring a network down, temporarily or for longer periods of time. And once again, there are a number of ways in which this can be done: intentionally or unintentionally, or simply by acts of God. So let's take a look at some of these. First of all, if you throw enough data at a system, it's going to choke. So a conventional DOS attack sends tons of packets to a server, fills up the pipe, blocking the authorized users, and just generally slowing things down. They'll stop a network from operating, and it's basically got the same effect as killing the communication path. And that's today's version of what people used to do with a sword and axe in the old days. This attack is called a bad fragmentation denial of service, and that's where large files are transmitted in a fragmented fashion. Quite often, you can't transmit an entire file in one packet. You've got to split it up. And if you have sequential files, you may have a part of one buttress to another, and so you've got fragments that get sent. And depending on how this is done and tampered with, it can lock up operating systems. So here in a teardrop attack, you've got some forged IP fragmented packets that overlap each other so they don't logically go back together, causing the system a hiccup, making it difficult to reassemble them, and potentially causing the machine to crash. Here you see sort of an example of that in the upper. Nice orderly set of fragments. You've got this. You see numerical order. But here, when something is fragmented incorrectly, you've got some numerical overlap. These don't fit together like these fit, and thereby have the potential to cause a problem. DDoS is a distributed denial of service. Not just one guy trying to bring something down, but a bunch of people from anywhere throwing data at that target to bring it to its knees. The ping of death is where the attacker sends huge ping packets of the target. So you can typically limit your ping packets to very, very small numbers of bits and get a response in a reasonable period of time. However, if you send very large packets with many, many bytes, then the receiving server has to try to assemble those packets and to make sense of them. And with enough of that, it can cause the server to lock up. So, ping of death. Now, botnets are a form of a distributed denial of service. Again, remember that DDoS is the result of many different entities coming in, attacking a target from a number of different locations or vectors. So botnets are unwilling servants of the hacker. Software or malware is implanted in these unwilling intermediate computers, and this can happen by a number of ways. And then upon command, these zombies or botnets go into action and attack that target. That's been used against countries like the country of Georgia. It's been used against South Korea, ostensibly by their neighbors to the north, and others. And those botnets or zombies can be from host machines all over the world. Russians can infect U.S. computers. U.S. hackers can infect European computers. It doesn't matter. To enable a botnet, what would normally happen? Well, via Trojan or some other means, malicious code would be downloaded into the target machine. It would typically sit there undetected, not working, until it was commanded to spring into action. And there are a variety of ways in which you can actually hide in that machine without being discovered. How is it spread? Well, by spam, by malware on websites, by ActiveX or JavaScripts, by worms, variety of things, all of which argues for the strongest possible device protection that you can get. Here again is a TCP header. Once again, notice the control bits. We're primarily concerned with ACK and SYN, and to some extent the one called RST or reset. And the three-way handshake is a SYN ACK sequence, and either side can send it the reset bit to end the communication. So with a SYN flood attack, you'd have a number of SYN bits being sent to, or SYN TCP/IP packets being sent to the target server. Target server's got to respond to all of them. And with every SYN comes potentially that SYN-ACK response from the target. Well, if he's tied up responding to all these SYNs with SYN-ACKs, could bog him down. That's why they call it a SYN flood attack. Okay, so the attacker would establish communications with multiple ports on the server and locks out the authorized user. Well, that's an attack on availability because authorized users are not able to get to it. The services on that port potentially would not be available to the true authorized user. So network security really involves a number of different aspects. Physical security, techniques to mitigate social engineering, security at the edge devices, within the network, and then to the endpoint, i.e. the ultimate user. There are three types of network security controls that we typically look at. Remember the acronym PAT, point after touchdown, or in this case, physical, administrative, and technical. On the physical side, having your normal physical security for network-related devices. access control in the facilities, CCTV for critical areas, personnel techniques, HVAC controls, lighting controls, and all of that. The things that you would do physically to secure the facility with a particular emphasis on the network services. Other controls have to do with administrative. This is certainly one means of dealing with the social engineering concerns. So having the appropriate policies in place, people trained and aware, hiring the right employees, dealing properly with disgruntled or terminated employees, network access that is revoked upon their leaving. All these are policies in the admin area that need to be part of the program. Then you have the true technical controls that get into the network equipment and applications itself. Things like firewalls, proper configuration of the network ports, routers, switches, etc., as well as the application patching and limiting the applications that are run on specific machines. Now, one concept that's often discussed, less now than it used to be, is the separation of networks. Now, networks can be separated, and when we talk about separated networks, I'm really referring to the security network and the corporate or enterprise network that is there for reasons other than security. For data transmission, for HR, for finance, for their website, email, whatever it might be. So it used to be that physical separation was recommended. That is, have one network, physical network, separate conductors and so forth for physical security, have another one for the rest of the enterprise functions. And that works. However, increasingly that's becoming less acceptable to upper management as there is the need to leverage the network equipment that is there, leverage the IT resources, use the information that is available from security for other purposes. It's this movement we call convergence. So physical separation is a way to do it, but there's another way to do it as well, and that's via logical separation. So we learned earlier in the course about VLANs, virtual local area networks, where you can take the equipment and logically partition it and restrict access just as if they were physically separated. Now that requires additional programming, additional security, a savvy IT department, and all that. But more and more that is becoming the means by which networks are separated, and not just physical security, but for other functions as well. And we'll talk about access control list here in just a little bit, but you can set access control on the VLANs, you can control traffic between the VLANs, who can go from one to another, and so forth. There's a whole body of knowledge just around the topic of provisioning proper security for VLANs. So just understand that we've got two approaches here, physical and logical, and the world is moving more and more towards the logical partitioning. On physically separate networks, you can use the same cable to carry the different network traffic, but just different pairs within that cable or within that bundle, be they UTP pairs or optical fibers. And that's particularly true within the backbone cabling between the main cross connect, where the services would originate, and through the vertical wiring to the telecommunications closet in the facility. Moving on to the topic of firewalls. So I think we can all envision what a firewall is. It's a gateway. It's a way to inhibit access from one portion of a network or one network to another. And so it's kind of like a bouncer standing at the door looking at credentials saying, sorry, who are you here to see? Well, you're not authorized to see him. And that is implemented through something called an access control list. Different from a card access system and the access control we think of in physical security, it's really a set of rules that says what kind of traffic can come in, what kind of traffic can leave, who can go out, who can come in, who can talk to who, and so forth. It's that list of rules that determine what actually gets through the firewall. Firewalls can filter packets, and we've got a couple of different kinds of that, one called stateful, one called stateless. So stateful really means that if one initiates a conversation with a host outside the network, and that would go out via a SYN bit, the firewall is smart enough to recognize the destination of that bit, and if that destination then responds with a SYN-ACK, then that would be allowed through because we're keeping track of the state of the communication. Stateless is more brute force. It does not keep track of that and simply enforces the rules that have been employed in the access control list. Firewalls can get pretty sophisticated. They can go and really look at the packets in depth, really getting to the point saying, well, is this protocol doing what it's supposed to be doing? This traffic doesn't quite look right. It's just a way of having a different level of scrutiny right down into the packet layer. And there are firewalls that actually enforce rules at the application layer, which which is all the way up the food chain at TCP/IP level 5. So here's a small example of firewall programming. In this case, we've got a host PC with the IP address of 192.168.1.10. You see that's our source IP for communication going out. Communication is emanating from port 2652, and it's going to this destination here, which corresponds to this web server down there, and that makes sense because it's looking to talk to port 80 on that web server, well-known port for HTTP. We've got a communication going out, then that web server responds. You see here's the source IP that matches this destination. Its destination is designed not for the user here, but it is going to the public IP address of this firewall, 34.12.240.6, but the port number 2652 that has been correlated with that port on this PC. So the firewall sees that destination, says, okay, that's for me, port 2652. It looks at the source IP address and says, okay, that's legit. I'm going to send that communication on to Mr. User PC right here, port number 2652. Now, let's say that we've got something that comes in from, again, the same source, and it's looking for 34.12.240.6, so it's going to hit this firewall, but it's looking for a port 80. So it's trying to hit the web server on this, and we haven't provided for that in our rules that we've written, and so it's going to block it. So that's, as I said, a simple example of firewall operation. Going back to firewall type, here we've mentioned packet filtering, and there are a number of options that that can be instilled into the rules. The sender or receiver based on IP address or based on destination ports, the MAC addresses, the TCP flags. Recall that a stateful inspection looks at those flags, the SYN, the SYN-ACK, to keep track of conversations, the protocols themselves, and of course whether the communication is outbound or inbound. Here you see more on the access control list. It's really comprised, the list itself, as a list of permit or deny rules for those things that we talk about. It's provision in the firewall or a router acting like a firewall. The access control list can be applied to individual VLANs, both outbound and inbound. And it really does serve to provide that firewall function. So here's a typical statement in an access control list. So this is the access control list number, and it's going to permit TCP traffic, source destination address, and actually sets up the firewall or the rule for this particular TCP communication. Packet filtering means that if the rules are not respected, that the packet is either blocked or just plain discarded. We've discussed this a little bit earlier. Here's another view of the three-way handshake that where the firewall or the router maintains that table and keeps track of the status of the communication between the two hosts, so that the normal communication, outgoing, response to the outgoing are permitted, but random incoming requests may in fact be blocked. So in some cases, you might simply want to block outbound traffic. If somebody has managed to access a server somewhere, by placing rules on what can leave and to whom it can go, can be just as, if not more important, than what's coming in. So we call that egress filtering. So these firewalls can be configured to watch for suspicious packets or certain kinds of information leaving the network and block those. There's both hardware and software to help implement some of these functions as well, or to supplement these functions. One common device is the IDS, or intrusion detection system. So that's either hardware or software that looks at the data packets looking for violations of certain rules. It itself will not block the communication. It will look at them, it will log them, and it'll report on them so that some other action can be taken. So looking at the bottom bullet, it logs and it notifies. Now, certain switches will allow you to dedicate ports to port mirroring, so that whatever is trafficking through one port is automatically duplicated on another port and then tied to the IDS system. That way the normal traffic flow is not interrupted, but the IDS is taking note of what's going on. And here's a graphic of that. Continuing along our thought of mitigating network security threats brings us back to the area of Wi-Fi. Now, there's some very simple things that can be done to help secure Wi-Fi. If you recall earlier on the NetStumbler graphic, we saw the SSIDs being documented. In fact, most wireless or laptops today have wireless capability and will go looking for available networks. So very, very often you'll see a list of networks come up, and those names will be the SSID. You can get into the access point and disable that SSID broadcast, so that if in fact somebody needs to join that network, they have to know its name, they have to ask to join it. If that network has then been secured, then they'll be asked to provide the proper security credentials or passwords or codes to get into it. So you want to enable encryption of the Wi-Fi as well. That is a no-brainer, and WPA2 is far more secure than WEP. WEP is more secure than nothing at all. You can limit the number of addresses that will be issued. You can actually define specific MAC addresses who are authorized to communicate to that access point. Physically, you may wish to use directional antennas so that you're reducing the, think of it as a cone of transmission, so that only a certain physical area might even be exposed to the Wi-Fi communication and have the opportunity to talk to the network. Other means of securing the network, if you think of the ports on a switch or any IP port as a door in the network, I think that's a pretty good analogy. And you want security around all those doors or ports. Turn off unused switch ports, like locking the door. Actually, do lock the door of the telecom closets and other network equipment so that people cannot get to those points. Look for the rogue access point. You know, it could be something that was planted inside for convenience or for malice by an employee or an outsider. Require regular password changes and make sure the passwords are strong passwords. And on the social side, increase employee awareness through training and proper policies. Periodically scan the network. Do internal scans. Gather the IP addresses of what's out there and what are they using. Are there open ports? Are there wireless devices out there that are communicating that shouldn't be? Consider turning off ping if it's appropriate. Secure your endpoints. These are your host computers. Regularly patch the operating systems. There are intrusion prevention systems, host-based, they're called HIPS or HIPS, that can be installed on individual machines to prevent many kinds of malicious attacks. Respect the principle of least privilege, and that is only allow or authorize a machine to do what it needs to do to accomplish the job. Make sure the application programmers employ secure techniques. And be paranoid. Assume the worst, whether it's outside data, applications, or users. Keep your patches up to date. You'll find things. You need to fix them. The contractors themselves have to look at their own devices as well as their clients. Are devices capable of being patched? Are there patches available? Is the vendor diligent about getting patches out? And then how do they get installed and by whom? So kind of wrapping this up, an approach for securing networks means first understanding the potential threats, testing to see what your vulnerabilities are and to see if your systems can be penetrated. Patch everything as patches become available. Think of security as a multi-level process, right from the edge through the network to the application, and look at it from several dimensions: the physical, the logical, the social. There's a term that's used that's called defense in depth. It's the multi-layered defense that I just mentioned. First of all, limit access to the data. Overlap your defenses. Make sure communication is encrypted. And we're talking not only Wi-Fi, but things like email, remote communication via remote access. Require authentication of devices to even communicate on the network. Quite often, authentication requires keys, public keys and private keys. Make sure your IT guys have a strong key management strategy. Employ the deny all doctrine. That's the process of turning off all the access to a device and then enabling only those remote communications that's necessary for it to work. And a lot of things, a lot of devices that come from vendors will have vulnerabilities that are intentional, like default passwords and open ports. Well, those need to get locked down. After the fact, check the logs of the servers for suspicious users. Look at your network logs. If there's IDS, intrusion detection, in place, look at those and try to do a post-mortem on what happened or is happening. Part of this, too, is having a proper time base. Network Time Protocol, or NTP, establishes that. Sometimes security portions of the network, particularly separate networks, are not always provisioned with an accurate time base, so understand what the time base for your network is. And if there is an intrusion, logs are available, then in order to build a case, part of that to go along with the log is making sure the timing was accurate. And this timing can coincide or correlate with some of the physical devices like your card access or a CCTV system. On a personal level, also a number of things that you can do with your devices. Email security. There is freeware as well as inexpensive software to maintain security of a personal device. And this includes full disk encryption for the hard drive on your computer. PGP is one that originally stood for pretty good privacy. There are others. On your web browsers, there are certain utilities that will be useful. For example, on Firefox, there's a no-script utility that allows you to authorize scripts one by one so that you can prohibit malicious scripts from coming in if you don't recognize them and being used against you. Antivirus is an obvious one. And in the future, the security of cell phones, the provisioning and use of cell phones, the data that they carry, passwords, their use for transactions are all going to be huge issues. And so as we go into the future, pay attention to the kinds of security vulnerabilities and features that may be associated with your smartphone. That brings us to the end of Section 8 of the ESNT course. There are a number of training and reference manuals that are available through Slayton Solutions. Your study guide for ESNT is available at Slayton Solutions. And this includes a PDF of these webinar sections, recorded webinars, quizzes with answers, and other helpful resources. So, secure your future with the ESNT training and certification program. This is network training for the security industry and something that will certainly help you in your careers moving forward. Thank you for attending. Thank you for listening.